All right, Ryan, what's on your radar?
Well, here is the thing about our country. It is extremely expensive to be poor. But if you're rich, you get paid for just the act of being rich. If you're rich, your income slides automatically into all sorts of different accounts that don't pay taxes, and you don't have to pay for those accounts. You actually get paid just for having your money sit there. If you're poor or if you're working class, you have to pay to cash your own paycheck, or you have to pay all sorts of fees to get anything resembling a credit card or bank account. If you're late on anything, here come the big late fees and here comes the interest. The one they really nail you with is the overdraft fee. Your wages are kept low enough that in the days before that paycheck lands in your account, there's a good chance your balance is down in the double or single digits, and you have to be careful about that card. But you've got a lot to worry about, while the only thing your bank is thinking about is how to bilk you out of as much money as possible. It's asymmetric warfare, and they've come up with all sorts of tricks. Say you've got a $29 balance, and you went out and you spent a few bucks on coffee, $10 on lunch, and then an Uber ride that hit peak and it cost you $30. That should be one overdraft, right? Wrong. They built an algorithm that'll move those purchases around so the $30 takes you under, boom, overdraft fee. Then the lunch takes you under again, boom, another overdraft fee. And then the coffee takes you under a third time. If the fees are $35, now you're out more than $100 on top of what you spent on everything else. These fees are so outrageous, I think we might finally be able to do something about them. There's already movement on the business side. On Tuesday, the Detroit-based Ally Financial became the first large bank to say it was ending overdraft fees. Their reason wasn't moral, but commercial. They found in studies that the fear of those fees was preventing low-income, predominantly black and brown customers from opening accounts. At some point, perhaps, screwing people over too hard becomes bad for business. Now, this comes as Biden has appointed the outspoken progressive Rohit Chopra to be head of the CFPB, and it's likely he'll take on overdraft fees. Elizabeth Warren recently went viral, smashing Jamie Dimon and other bankers about overdraft fees.
So let's take a look at who actually paid these fees. According to Pew Charitable Trusts, it's disproportionately working people making less than $50,000 a year, African Americans, Hispanics, people who are struggling to get by. And how much did they pay in overdraft fees? They paid a combined $4 billion. So let me start with you, Mr. Dimon. You are the star of the overdraft show. Your bank, JP Morgan, collects more than 7 times as much money in overdraft fees per account than your competitors. So, Mr. Dimon, how much did JP Morgan collect in overdraft fees from their consumers in 2020?
Well, I think your numbers are totally inaccurate, but we'll have to sit down privately and go through that.
These are public numbers.
In the House, Carolyn Maloney is preparing a bill. In the Senate, Sherrod Brown and Cory Booker are looking at it. A private survey conducted after the last election by Republican pollster Patrick Ruffini found that 69% of voters think overdraft fees are too high. That includes 62% of Republicans. And by a 29-point margin, voters want Congress to take action. You can't find that kind of consensus on anything. And so here comes the bank pushback. Last week, the Wall Street Journal ran a story that very much looks like it was pitched to them by the banks. Here's the headline and the subhead. Overdraft fees fell in the COVID-19 economy. Many people curbed their spending and lenders waived fees, pushing down overdraft revenue nearly 10% in 2020. Well, isn't that so nice of those banks? Though as Warren got the bankers to admit at the hearing, they only waived fees for people who specifically lobbied to have their fees waived, and they still made billions. A closer look at the pattern suggests that it wasn't bank generosity that led to fewer overdraft fees. It was direct checks and the boost in unemployment. The CARES Act passed in March, and look at what happened to overdraft fees when people had more money in their accounts. And look what happened as it ran out. Google searches for overdraft show the same pattern. So this was not the banks being nice. Bloomberg had a different defense in the wake of Dimon getting embarrassed. Actually, Bloomberg said, it's those regional banks, not the big boys, that really rely on overdraft fees. Bloomberg cited a Morgan Stanley paper showing that a regional bank in Alabama collected 5% of all of its revenue from overdraft fees. Great. So ban it. That's your best defense?
Okay,
that it's not just the bank, that's not just the big ones, but the regional banks too?
Well, and yeah, that's also reminds me of Elizabeth Warren's point. And by the way, the Elizabeth Warren clip with Jamie Dimon is absolutely fire. It is so lit. That is so funny. She's just like laying into Wall Street and then goes, let's start with you, Mr. Diamond.
He's like, what? Who?
They cut to him looking like a Bond villain reclining in his chair. And she makes the point when she was queuing up that conversation with Jamie Dimon, she makes the point that the Federal Reserve extended the courtesy to banks and then recommended the banks extend that courtesy to their customers. And that's not what happened. And what I think is particularly grating when you look at these stories is how well these folks did during the pandemic. And how much money they made during the pandemic and how much money they made off of things like this during the pandemic. And this is what, nobody raised their hand when Elizabeth Warren asked them how many of them had extended that courtesy to their customers. So what, I guess, power do consumers have to push back on high overdraft fees when all of the banks are doing it, all of the few banks who do this are doing it at the same time? It's disempowering to consumers. It's obviously something that needs to be talked about. And I'm glad that you did your radar on this because it's something that actually flies under the radar.
Right, it does. Well, what consumers have is their government. And so, like I said, Rohit Chopra, it's kind of shocking. That he has a prominent position still in government because he has, consistently positioned himself aggressively as a foe of big corporations. And so he's now at the head of the CFPB. The CFPB, squarely has overdraft fees in its scope. And so what that will do just by having him in that position, it's going to have banks, redoing a lot of their policies to try to get ready for whatever the CFPB is going to do, and so you're going to see them be slightly, probably less rapacious in how they go after it. It'd be nice if Congress does something about it. Maloney should do her bill. Cory Booker and Sherrod Brown, they should do their bill. Warren obviously legislates on this, and if they can get it into some must-pass piece of legislation, you could see that. The poll that I got my hands on also compared overdraft fees to payday lending, and people were asked, should payday lenders and overdraft fees be required to have the same kind of uniform policies? And people said yes, and they also said that there should be strict limits on what kind of overdraft fees these banks can charge, and whether they can charge them at all. They are, overdraft fees are kind of the worst offense and the most offensive to your soul and as you're engaging, but they're also substantial. They make up something close, for a lot of banks, they make up close to 50% of these fees that they're extracting from people. It's something that produces so much anxiety too. And so Ally Financial, be curious what your experience has been like this, because we came up, I'm older than you, so we came up different decades apart. But I grew up poor and was struggling well into my 20s, and so back when I had an account with SunTrust, I had this setup where I would pay a very nominal fee and I had overdraft protection, and that saved me for years. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, I start getting these little, basically postcards in the mail, and every time you see that postcard, you're like, oh, there's another $35. And I called, I'm like, what is going on here? Why am I have overdraft protection? And they said, oh, well, so we ended that program, but we grandfathered in the people who were in it. But our records show that you called and requested to have that program taken away. Mm. You didn't want to be in it anymore. Like, I would never purposely call a bank in order for any reason.
I was going to say.
Definitely not to call to say, take away my. I'm like, that's a lie. Put me back in it. And they're like, sorry, it's gone. You can't get back in it anymore. Mm. There was no CFPB to complain to at the time, and so, every time I would come home and see one of those cards, like, God. no, $35. And then you're like, what was the thing that I bought that cost me this $35? And it's just so cruel that the way our society makes you pay to be poor. You should have to pay to be rich because it's a privilege to be rich in this society. Being poor is the burden that you bear in order to make those people rich.
It's the way you started off your radar. I think you really nailed it, that it is very, very expensive to be poor in this country. And to some extent, it's because there's a system that is set up by lobbyists and special interests that preys on the poor because, it's obvious that banks need to have some incentive for people not to be overdrafting constantly, right? Like they do need to have some mechanism and they should have every right to have some mechanism. But it becomes predatory when they're all doing the exact same thing and consumers are powerless to say, one thing or the other. I mean, I actually bank locally. I still bank locally in Wisconsin. I have a great experience with that. But it's very different when you are working with somebody like SunTrust or when you're working with somebody like Citibank or JP Morgan, whatever it is. People are having a different experience, and that's a completely valid point. How does it stop, right? Consumers can't take their business just to another bank because it's happening at the other bank too.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. So if you're a politician out there and you want to do something popular, crack down on these overdraft fees.
Absolutely.
Coming up, Andrew Feldman and Inez Stepman join us for panel when Rising returns.